So, you want to leave this valley? Well, that won't be easy, as you, my fellow adventurer, are now bound to this valley by the stone in your chest, and leaving it like this would be your certain doom.
It can be tough to stand out from the pack when creating another Dark Souls-inspired action game to toss on the pile. In theory, developer Point Blank Games had the right idea of how to do it with Stray Blade, making a more approachable Souls-like with a focus heavily on traditional storytelling and a bright fantasy setting. But while that makes for a great first impression, every piece of it falls both short of its own ambitions and the high bar set by others in the genre.
This stupid plant!
Poor level design, uninteresting world building, and shoddy combat mechanics keep this Stray from ever finding its way home.
Beyond that gate waits a trial, your test, to see if you'll be able to make the journey to your savior. But first, you'll have to find a way behind the gate.
As the capable and curious Farron, you find yourself trapped on a magical island of Akrea, with no way off besides being led on a quest to kill some big bad guys, break a magical seal, and yada yada yada, you know the drill. As much as I came to like the self-important Heart of Gold hero Farron and their relationship to their scrappy and altruistic spell-slinging sidekick Boji...
What?
Nothing. Just imagined it.
Always glad to amuse you.
The story has nothing you haven't heard before and is told in largely forgettable expository dialogue and lore pickups. When following the main path, I felt like I was stopping to hear the two characters riffing off of one another about the local environment, their backgrounds, or the mission way too often.
Still struggling with the talking, walking magic wolf part?
You would too if you were in my skin.
The trope of the lonely, barren, and opaque Souls-like storytelling is tired these days, but Stray Blade feels like it overcorrected in its attempt to swing the opposite way.
A hard battle, promising only certain death. That is for anyone but you.
The world itself is very pretty, at least. Its epic scale and bright colors really help Akrea look like a storybook fantasy world teeming with magic. The locations themselves don't feel very different from one another outside of the colors and flora though. You do the same sort of platforming and cave skulking in each region, where you'll find a plethora of nooks and crannies hiding crafting materials or lore stones. I found myself getting distracted by side paths a lot during the roughly 18 hours it took me to finish Stray Blade, and I always felt like the end prize was worth the trouble.
Did you write that down?
That said, the layouts of these regions are often confusing, lacking many good landmarks to help navigate with. The in-game map and on-screen compass do a mediocre job of helping you find your way on task as well. The former has no way to indicate elevation, so you can't tell if a location is high on a mountain or deep in a valley. Meanwhile, the compass can show you which direction to go, but not what path to take. So you'll often have to rely on the context clues of Boji occasionally flagging you down and pointing you to the right direction, but even then, Boji has a habit of just showing up in places that aren't even the right direction at all.
Have you gotten stronger, or are they weaker?
Each locale is brimming with hostile enemies who do not take kindly to your presence. You'll exhaust the variety of these enemies pretty early, with stronger versions swapping colors and adding a new attack here and there later on. Combat, though largely restricted by stamina with combos based on a weapon type a la Dark Souls, tries to spice up the well-worn formula to mix results. Weapons themselves come in many forms, each with their own light and heavy attacks. Some of the more unique weapons, like the arcane ones you have to explore and find in the mid to end game, were lots of fun. Some of my favorites include an unreasonably large molten sword that explodes on impact, or a katana that grows in size after every swing and a combo. Enemy attacks are color-coded, red ones must be dodged and blue ones can only be parried. Perfect timing on a dodge or a parry refunds some stamina back to you, and on-time parries specifically can drain enemy poise meters, which opens them up for executions when fully empty.
I was supposed to go much further.
The problem is that the timing windows are all over the map, with a mix of muddy responsiveness and some deceptive enemy animations that can give nailing these defensive maneuvers a frustrating learning curve. Missing feels particularly bad too, as enemies can easily catch you in extremely punishing stun loops in return. The red light blue light concept itself serves to make combat easier than Stray Blade's contemporaries, but also far less expressive. You'll spend most of your time defending with a binary choice, attacking in a window you opened, and then repeating until the enemy is dead. The true difficulty waxes and wanes because of factors like enemy behavior. which regularly goes off the rails, causing enemies to stand idle or awkwardly run in circles, or in some instances be so evasive that they would rather walk themselves off of cliffs than die to Farron's blade. When fighting more than one enemy at a time, Stray Blade's truly abysmal lock-on system either sticks hard to one enemy and refuses to change targets, or when it does change, usually when the original target is defeated, it chooses the enemy that makes the least sense to target next.
Astounding! There is always more to find.
The skill tree is large, but a bit of a misnomer, as any of the actual skills you learn all come from outside of this tree, usually from defeating bosses. Instead, it's more of an elaborate stat sheet that encourages you to try lots of different weapons, because enhancing things like maximum health or base attack damage is tied to how many kills you have with each one of them. This gates your power and your feeling of overall growth behind your ability to craft new weapons and find new blueprints, the former of which is more of a pain than the latter. I spent so much of my adventuring time picking up materials and still never seemed to have enough to craft all of the blueprints, burning a hole in my inventory.
Out! Out, 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 out! Harder! Carefully! With feeling!
The more interesting skills Farron gets access to are special abilities earned by taking down bosses. Even though they all have uses in and out of combat, their battle effects are lackluster in comparison to the regular weapons. One late game ability, Shion, stops foes in their tracks for a moment, which is great until only an hour or so later, when many of the enemies become completely immune to it. The one I use the most, Intium, allows you to teleport to targets, but the attack itself does very little damage and leaves you susceptible to counterattacks since it doesn't stagger enemies. Boji has his own skill tree too, which allows you to power up both the abilities you can command him to use and runes that give you passive combat abilities for a limited time. His abilities can be helpful, like one that fires a bolt of force and chips away at enemy poise, but I found that I got far more use out of the runes, which require small amounts of materials that give you buffs like health recovery after finishing off enemies. My favorite, knocked over enemies that did damage to me, which went a long way towards evening the playing field of Stray Blade's inconsistent combat.
So why do you need to go to that tower? You know my reason, but I don't know yours.
The striking color palette of Stray Blade's world and its simplified combat are admirable, but flawed attempts to stand out amongst a growing din of FromSoftware-inspired action RPGs. Its large scale turns that lovely world into a labyrinth bloated with endless pickups, made maddening by a miserable map. Combat is fun when it's not bogged down by an unbearable lock-on mechanic and some repetitive and truly dumb enemies. When taken together with a forgettable story and likable but long-winded characters, Stray Blade is an adventure more frustrating than fanciful.
No hope for mercy in this world.
For more action, check out our reviews of Star Wars Jedi Survivor or Ravenbound. And for everything else, stick with IGN.